Parade. Our reporter Aisha Ismail is still there. Aisha, good to talk to you. How well was the president's speech received?
Well, there were hundreds of people who gathered here on the Grand Parade just outside the City Hall to come and participate in the celebrations and also to remember Nelson Mandela. And of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa reflected on that day in 1990 because he was at the Victor Verster prison when Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. He also was here the day at the time when Nelson Mandela took to the podium, took to the balcony and addressed tens of thousands of people. And it was President Cyril Ramaphosa who held the mic for Nelson Mandela when he was speaking. And so today, President Ramaphosa's speech was one again of peace and reconciliation. But I'm joined now by somebody who was also part of the Release Mandela campaign, somebody who was incarcerated at the time, somebody who called for Nelson Mandela's release and who also was there when Nelson Mandela walked out of the grates of Victor Verster. Jay Naidu, it's been 30 years since that day. How do you feel today?
Well, I'm 30 years older, so I was 35 then, the General Secretary of COSATU. And on that particular day, as a member of the reception committee, I was part of security. And so we arrived very early in the morning. I was amongst the first to arrive at Victor Verster, and not understanding what to expect because there had been no recent photograph of him, and all we knew, he was represented the symbol of our resistance against apartheid. He was the face of our campaign to free ourselves. And there's this extraordinary, tall, elegant-looking gentleman that opens the door and then proceeds to show us the house he had lived in for the last few years and asked us whether we wanted to have some tea and biscuits. And so the whole world is expecting him to be released and to see what he represents and who he is. And here he is showing us around the house and preparing tea for us. But it was an extraordinary moment. It was a moment that, as President Cyril Ramaphosa mentioned, characterized that climax of that international solidarity movement linked with the mass struggles of our people coming to its realization that there was the future president of our country. And as we arrived in the square, the crowds had swelled to such an extent that the car literally was being crushed. And so, yes, that moment reminds us of the ecstasy, the joy, the way in which it liberated so many people around the world who were fighting struggles against racism, against prejudice, for self-determination, for human rights, for social justice. And what I think today, as I stand here 30 years later, is I hope that we could recommit to those values that choose love and compassion and generosity over hatred, over arrogance, over corruption, that we could recommit as 55 million South Africans that are striving to ensure that power is not there for us to exercise as individuals, to enrich ourselves. But as Nelson Mandela said on the day, I stand before you as your servant and not a prophet. And if we could find that way to dialogue in a meaningful way, understanding that there's tremendous anger about the disappointment, the disillusionment, about the exclusion, and we could find a way to see each other, to hear each other, to be part of understanding what it means to be human, then we will realize what Nelson Mandela stood for, that the meaning of our lives is about sacrifice, is about service, is about compassion and love, and creating opportunities for the future generations.
Thank you so much for your time. And that was Jay Naidu, the former General Secretary of COSATU.